Ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoy my video, please click the like button and share the video. It is the only way the YouTube algorithms really notices me. I will be very grateful to you. The city streets that only appear at night. Scary story published by Scare Fiction. Read for you by Scare Fiction. Chapter 1. The Disappearance. Ethan gripped the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the quiet streets of Briarwood, the small suburban town where he grew up. The sun had long since set, and the air had grown cold, sending shivers down his spine. It was a place of familiarity. Trees lined the streets like sentinels, the same houses he remembered, the same worn-out streets. But tonight, something felt different. The shadows seemed deeper, the air heavier, as though something was holding its breath. It had been 2 weeks since he'd returned to Briarwood, forced to take a leave of absence from his job as a journalist in Chicago. The car accident that took his parents had left him shattered. He was now responsible for his younger sister, Lily. At 14, she was still trying to make sense of it all, still a little girl lost in a world she didn't understand. The town was buzzing with talk whispers, half-jokes, and the occasional nervous glance as neighbors gossiped about the recent string of disappearances. 3 people in as many weeks. None of them found. They all vanished under the cover of night, the streets they'd walked on seemingly erased as if they'd never existed. Rumors swirled about phantom streets that emerged when the moon rose, leading people into darkness. But Ethan dismissed them. Urban legends, the kind small towns thrive on. Ethan glanced at Lily's empty seat. She should be home by now. He tried calling her, but there was no answer. He checked the time again. 10:47 p.m. She had promised to be back by 9. As he pulled up to their house, he felt a strange sense of dread. He rushed inside, but the house was silent. No sign of Lily. His heart thudded in his chest. He called her name, his voice cracking with panic, but there was only the hollow sound of his own voice echoing back at him. That's when he noticed the note on the kitchen table, scribbled in hurried, uneven handwriting. If you want to find her, follow the streets that appear at night. His blood ran cold. The rumors, could they be true? Without thinking, he grabbed his jacket and stepped into the night, the cold air biting at his skin. As he walked deeper into the town, he began to notice the streets changing. There were new alleys, streets that had never been there before, shadowy, decaying, and lit by flickering street lamps that barely illuminated the darkness. A gust of wind rattled the branches overhead, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. The sound of footsteps, too close and too fast, echoed in the distance. His pulse quickened. He started to run. Suddenly, the street beneath his feet vanished, leaving him standing in an empty lot, his heart pounding in his ears. The night seemed to swallow him whole. Had he really seen it? Or was it his mind breaking? Chapter 2. A Map of Darkness. Ethan's pulse still throbbed in his ears as he stumbled back from the empty lot. His breath came in ragged gasps, the cold night air burning his lungs. He blinked into the darkness, disoriented. Had he really seen the streets disappear? Or was it his mind unraveling from the stress? The panic gnawed at him. Lily was out there somewhere. He had to find her. Back inside his house, Ethan slammed his laptop open. He needed answers, something that made sense in a world where nothing did anymore. His fingers flew across the keyboard, searching through old news stories, online forums, and police reports. The more he dug, the more the town's history grew darker. One name kept cropping up: the Night City. The myth was ancient, passed down in hushed whispers, dismissed as urban legend. But Ethan found the same tale repeated in every source, as though the town itself was trying to keep it buried. The stories spoke of a hidden city that only appeared at night, an eerie, twisted place where people vanished without a trace. Those who entered rarely returned, and those who did were never the same. They spoke of shadows in the corners of their vision, of strange streets that defied the laws of nature, of doors that slammed shut, trapping them in endless loops of horror. But no one had ever solved the mystery. The night city had no map, no discernible pattern. It seemed to shift every night, pulling in the lost, the desperate, the curious, and then swallowing them whole. Ethan's fingers hovered over the keyboard. Was this real? Could the stories be true? Just as doubt began to creep in, the front door creaked open. Ethan turned to see an old man standing in the doorway. His face was weathered, eyes sharp under the weight of years. He looked like he hadn't seen a bed in months, maybe years. His clothes were torn and dirty, and his breath stank of whiskey and decay. "I know what you're looking for," the man said, his voice low and rasping. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. How could he know? The man stepped inside, ignoring Ethan's silent question. "You're looking for your sister. I can help." He handed Ethan a crumpled, hand-drawn map. "This is all I've got, but it won't do you any good," the man added, his voice shaking. "The streets, they don't follow any logic. They change every night. I got out once. You don't want to go back." Ethan glanced at the map, his mind racing. The streets were distorted, lines drawn like an ancient riddle, clashing and shifting, leading into a darkness that no sane person would want to enter. But Lily was down there. He had no choice. That night, armed with the map, Ethan returned to the streets. The air was colder now, heavier, thick with something he couldn't quite name. He followed the twisted streets, and with each step, the world seemed to grow darker. At first, everything seemed normal until the whispers began. Faint at first, just a whisper in the wind. But soon, they grew louder, murmuring incoherently in languages he couldn't understand. Doors slammed shut behind him, one after another. Figures, shadows with no shape darted just out of sight. Ethan gripped the map tightly as he heard a familiar, chilling sound, a soft, high-pitched giggle. "Lily." He turned a corner and found a clue, a tiny trinket from her favorite necklace, half buried in the dirt. But as he reached for it, the ground shifted. The street was gone. The map was useless. He was trapped. His mind raced, but survival instincts kicked in. He turned and ran, his heart in his throat, as the streets around him twisted and collapsed like a maze of shifting mirrors. He barely escaped with his life. And Lily was still out there. Chapter 3. The Echoing Steps. Ethan couldn't shake the cold dread that clung to him, even after he escaped the twisting streets. The city was alive. He felt it, sensed it. Something had followed him back, though he couldn't prove it. His mind swirled with the fragmented images of the crumbling buildings, the shadows that shifted without reason, and the whispers that seemed to chase him. Determined to find out more, he sought out the only lead he had, Marla Hawkins, one of the few survivors of the night city. She was a recluse now, living in a small, rundown apartment on the edge of town. Ethan knocked on her door, hearing the faint shuffle of feet on the other side before it creaked open. Marla's eyes were wild, darting around as if she expected something to be lurking behind him. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. She didn't invite him in, but motioned for him to follow. Inside, the walls were covered with frantic scrawls of symbols and maps, crude drawings of streets that twisted into impossible angles. Ethan's stomach churned. They looked too familiar. "I need to know what's in that city," Ethan said, forcing strength into his voice. "I need to find my sister." Marla's expression softened for a moment, but then her eyes glazed over with the haunted look of someone who had seen too much. She didn't speak at first, just stared out the window, lost in a memory she couldn't escape. "You think it's just the streets?" she muttered. "But it's more. So much more. The city, it's alive, and it watches." She paused, her voice shaking. "It mimics, echoes. You think you're alone, but it follows you. It's always there, matching your every step. And when you think you're safe, that's when it comes." Ethan felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. "What do you mean, echoes?" Marla looked him dead in the eye. "Footsteps. It walks when you walk, stops when you stop. It doesn't want to be seen, but it's always there, always." That night, armed with Marla's warning, Ethan ventured back into the night city, the crumpled map clenched tightly in his hand. As he walked the darkened streets, he began to hear it. At first, they mirrored his one step forward, then another. But when he stopped, the footsteps didn't. They continued, slow and deliberate, as though something was creeping up behind him. His heart pounded in his chest, but when he spun around, the street was empty. Only shadows stared back at him, twisting in the flickering light. The deeper he went, the more the city seemed to mock him. Buildings leaned inward, their windows blinking like eyes. Alleyways stretched endlessly, beckoning him into their black depths. Cries for help echoed through the distance, but when Ethan followed them, they turned into cruel, mocking laughter. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure shrouded in darkness, standing just at the edge of the streetlight's glow. It didn't move, but somehow Ethan knew it was watching him. Worse, it knew his name. He ran, heart hammering, the figure's presence burning in his mind. When he finally stumbled out of the city's grasp, gasping for breath, the night was eerily quiet. But the encounter left him shaken, his mind torn between what was real and what the city had planted inside him. Was it just a trick of the city, or had something far worse found him? Chapter 4. The Vanishing Point. Ethan woke with a jolt, drenched in sweat, his body aching. He blinked, disoriented, staring at the ceiling. Cuts, thin red lines snaked across his arms and legs, stinging as if freshly made. Bruises dotted his skin, dark and angry. He didn't remember falling or hitting anything, but then again, the nights were becoming a blur of terror and confusion. He stumbled out of bed, gripping the edge of the bathroom sink. His reflection stared back at him, but something was off. His eyes, they weren't his. The pupils seemed darker, slightly wider, as though someone were staring through him. Ethan turned away, his breath shallow. The city was getting to him, creeping into his mind, twisting reality. The scratches and bruises were proof that the city wasn't just a nightmare. It could reach him, even here, even in the daylight. Lily was still out there, and every moment he spent doubting his sanity was another moment lost. He needed help, real help. That's when he found Grace. Grace was a paranormal investigator who'd been studying the strange occurrences surrounding Briarwood for years. Her apartment, cluttered with files and photos of mysterious disappearances, had the air of someone deeply obsessed. As soon as Ethan stepped inside, he could feel the weight of her obsession with the night city. "It's not just the place," she told him, flipping through a stack of old articles. "It's a reflection, a mirror of our darkest fears, our losses, the things we're most afraid to face. That's why it's different for everyone. The city feeds off you, off your mind." Ethan didn't know what to make of her theories, but one thing was clear: Grace believed in the night city. She had studied its patterns, talked to the few survivors, and even ventured into its shifting streets herself. "There's a center," Grace explained, showing him a crude map. A vanishing point. It's where the city holds those it's taken. If we can reach it, we might be able to bring Lily back. That night, Ethan and Grace descended into the city together, armed with more than just a map. But the deeper they went, the more the city pushed back. Buildings loomed higher, their walls cracking and groaning as though alive. Endless staircases spiraled into darkness, stretching impossibly far into the depths. Shadows flitted at the edges of Ethan's vision, flickering like memories of something he'd forgotten. Then came the figures. They appeared at random faces Ethan knew all too well. His mother, his father, their faces twisted and distorted, mouths curled in cruel smiles. They beckoned to him, their voices soft but full of malice. "Turn back, Ethan. Let her go. It's too late for Lily." His chest tightened as he saw their ghostly forms, memories that should have brought him comfort now used as weapons. The city was digging into his mind, using his deepest wounds against him. His parents stood in the doorway of a decaying house, their eyes hollow, their skin pale and stretched thin over their bones. Grace grabbed his arm, snapping him back to reality. "They're not real, Ethan. Keep moving." But the voices lingered, worming their way into his thoughts, planting seeds of doubt. He wasn't just losing Lily. He was losing himself. As they pressed on, the streets grew darker, narrower, suffocating in their silence. And ahead, Ethan could feel it, the pull of the vanishing point, a place that felt both near and impossibly far, like a distant nightmare he could never quite wake from. But the closer they got, the more the city twisted around him, pulling him deeper into his own mind. And it wanted him to stay, forever. Chapter 5. The Streets of the Lost. Ethan's breath came in shallow gasps as he stumbled through the darkened streets, the air around him thick with dread. Every corner they turned seemed to lead them deeper into a nightmare. But no matter how much ground they covered, the vanishing point remained elusive, just beyond reach, like a cruel joke played by the city. Grace kept pace beside him, her eyes darting around nervously. They had ventured further than before, past crumbling buildings that seemed to lean inward, their hollow eyes watching, judging. The streets grew narrower, the sky above closing in, as though the city itself was folding them in, squeezing their sanity with every step. It was then that they heard the voices' whispers on the wind, soft and broken. Ethan's pulse quickened. He glanced at Grace, who seemed to hear them too, her face pale. "We're not alone," she whispered. They stepped into a small, abandoned playground. The swings creaked in the wind, swaying back and forth on their own. Broken slides loomed like ghostly figures in the dark. Ethan's heart sank as he saw it, Lily's jacket, crumpled near the base of a rusted slide. He rushed forward, his hand trembling as he picked it up. It was cold, damp, and empty. The weight of the moment hit him like a punch to the chest. She'd been here, he could feel it. But where was she now? Before he could gather his thoughts, a voice rang out from behind them. A man, disheveled and filthy, staggered into the playground. His eyes were wild, his skin pale and sallow. He mumbled incoherently, his words broken by the occasional sob. "You're going to die here," he whispered, his eyes darting toward the black voids that yawned where buildings used to stand. "We all do." Ethan turned to Grace, but she was already backing away, her expression tight with fear. They'd seen people like him before, lost souls, wandering the city for years, broken by the endless horrors. But this man was different. He wasn't the only one. As they made their way through the playground, more figures emerged, silent and broken. Some stared at them with hollow eyes, whispering warnings in low, cracked voices. Others moved with jerky, animalistic desperation, clawing at the air, their minds lost to the city's madness. Ethan shivered, his skin crawling. The whispers grew louder, echoing in his head, speaking in voices he recognized Lily's voice, calling his name. "Ethan, help me." He staggered, his mind swirling. Was she still alive? Or had the city already consumed her, leaving only her echoes behind? The shadows around him stirred, their movements too fast, too wrong to be natural. Shapes twisted and crawled, their forms shifting with a grotesque fluidity. Grace grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "It's feeding off you, Ethan. The more you fear, the more it pulls you in." He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. The city was alive, hunting them through its maze of shifting streets. They weren't just trapped in the city, they were part of it now. The walls seemed to close in, collapsing into black voids, devouring everything in their path. And somewhere, deep within the city's core, something was waiting for them. Something that wanted to tear them apart, body and mind. Ethan couldn't run anymore. The city was in his head, and he didn't know if he could escape. Chapter 6. The Heart of Darkness. Ethan's legs were leaden as he and Grace pushed forward, stumbling through the endless labyrinth of the city. The air felt thicker here, almost suffocating, like the walls themselves were closing in, whispering promises of despair. Every step brought them closer to the heart of the city, the place where everything converged, where the streets twisted together in an impossible knot of darkness. It was the vanishing point. Ahead, the ground seemed to ripple, the architecture warping and distorting until they found themselves standing in the middle of an uncanny replica of Briarwood, only twisted, distorted beyond recognition. The houses were half decayed, the trees blackened and skeletal. The familiar streets had become narrow, winding paths that led to nowhere. This was the city's core, a grotesque mockery of home, a nightmarish echo of everything they had known. The air vibrated with an oppressive sense of dread, like the city was holding its breath, waiting for something. Then they saw it. A dark shape looming in the distance, formless, shifting. It moved like smoke, but with a weight to it that defied nature. The figure loomed larger, its presence oppressive, swallowing the very light around them. Ethan's heart raced as he took a step back, but Grace gripped his arm, her face pale. "It's here," she whispered. The entity spoke, its voice a low, mocking rasp, as if it were coming from the very air itself. "Welcome to the end, Ethan." A chill ran down Ethan's spine. This was it. The thing that had been feeding on his fear and everyone else's since the beginning of time. The creature's form shifted, revealing something that almost looked like a face, if one could call it that. Its eyes were deep, hollow voids, filled with something ancient and wicked. It moved closer, its voice growing louder, but it wasn't the voice that terrified Ethan, it was the offer it made. "If you want your sister back," it crooned, "you must stay here. Forever. Become part of the city, just like all the others." Grace let out a sharp breath. "No, Ethan. Don't listen to it. This is what it wants to trap you." But Ethan wasn't listening anymore. He was too focused on the visions that the entity had begun to show him. Lily, her face twisted in pain, screaming for help, trapped in the depths of the city, her eyes hollow and pleading. He blinked. Was this real? Or was it just another trick of the city? The entity spoke again, its voice dripping with malice. "Your sister is here. And so are all the others who entered this place. You can have her back if you offer yourself. Your pain will be her freedom." His mind spun as the weight of the decision pressed down on him. If he gave himself up, if he stayed here, he might get Lily back. But what if it was all an illusion? What if she was already gone, trapped in the city's endless torment, and this was nothing but another cruel ploy to break him. Was the city playing with his mind? Or was this his only choice? The walls around them seemed to pulse with the weight of the decision. Ethan was losing himself, and he didn't know if he'd ever get out again. Chapter 7. The Sacrifice. The weight of the decision pressed down on Ethan, heavier than the darkness surrounding him. The entity loomed, its form twisting, eyes glowing like deep voids. The very air vibrated with its power, suffocating him in a silence that stretched between heartbeats. Ethan's gaze shot to Grace, standing beside him, her face a mask of fear and determination. She knew, like he did, that the creature wasn't lying. The price of getting Lily back was steep, too steep, and yet it was the only option left. Then the entity spoke again, its voice slithering through the air. "You can have her, Ethan, but your pain, your torment, must remain. It is the only currency I accept." The words cut deeper than any knife. Ethan's heart thudded painfully in his chest. His guilt, the guilt of having survived while Lily was taken, the guilt over his failure to protect her pressed in from all sides. It was suffocating him. Without warning, the world around them shifted. The city ripped open like a wound, and Ethan found himself back in the moment that had haunted him for years, his parents' death. He was in the car, the screeching tires, the flash of headlights, the crushing impact. His mother's screams, the sound of broken glass. Ethan's hands trembled. His chest burned. "You weren't there to save them," the entity whispered in his ear. "And you couldn't save her either." A roar built up in Ethan's throat, the pain and guilt threatening to overwhelm him. He couldn't take it anymore, but then he saw Grace standing beside him, her eyes locked on him, silently urging him to fight. Grace stepped forward, her voice trembling as she whispered, "I can make it stop for a moment, so you can save her." Before Ethan could react, Grace closed the distance between them, her hand glowing with a strange, otherworldly light. She didn't hesitate. She sacrificed herself. A blinding flash erupted from her body, and the world seemed to collapse inward. The entity shrieked in fury as Grace's body disintegrated, the light breaking through the darkness like a beacon. The ground shook beneath their feet, the streets cracking and splitting apart as the city began to crumble. Ethan didn't have time to mourn. He didn't have time to process what had just happened. He ran through the collapsing streets, past the crumbling facades of Briarwood's twisted version, until he found her Lily standing at the edge of a blackened chasm, her eyes hollow, her face twisted in fear. "Lily," he cried, his voice breaking. But as he reached her, doubt gripped him. Was this real? Was she truly there? Or was the city toying with him once more? The shadows around them stretched and twisted, closing in on them. The city was crumbling, its final weapon being the doubt in Ethan's mind. Even as he reached for her, part of him feared that this wasn't his sister. This was just another illusion, a trick of the city designed to break him. Lily's voice cracked through the darkness. "Ethan, I need you." But as the shadows stretched, Ethan realized something. The city was feeding on his torment. He had to let go of his guilt. He had to stop doubting. In that moment of clarity, he understood the only way to break free. And so, Ethan let go of the pain. And the city started to fall apart. Chapter 8. The city disappears. The air was crisp, almost too clean, as Ethan stepped out of the wreckage of the night city and into the familiar streets of Briarwood. For a moment, it felt like waking from a nightmare. The quiet suburban homes stood in neat rows. The cracked sidewalks and familiar diner looked just as they had before. The same old playground where he'd once played with Lily, the same rusty street lamp on the corner. His hands shook as he pulled Lily close. She was alive. They were both alive. It was over. "Ethan," she said softly, her head resting against his chest. "We made it." He exhaled, his heart still pounding in his ears. He hugged her tighter, trying to silence the dark whisper that lingered in his mind. Could it really be over? Or had they simply escaped the nightmare, only to find themselves trapped in another one? But for now, there was relief. They were home, and nothing could be worse than the twisted streets of the city that had almost claimed them. As they walked through the streets, Ethan's hope started to erode. There was something off. The town felt too quiet, too still. People moved around him, going about their daily routines, but their faces, they weren't right. They glanced at him with those strange, unfamiliar eyes, like they recognized him but didn't remember. Like they knew him, but not completely. His pulse quickened as he scanned the houses. The road signs were the same, but the houses his eyes kept playing tricks on him. He saw the old playground, but it felt wrong now. The swings creaked in a way they shouldn't. The trees cast twisted, unnatural shadows. The houses were in the wrong places, and the air felt thick, heavy, as if something was breathing. Lily, though, seemed unfazed. She walked alongside him, her face blank, as if the night city had never happened. "Ethan," she said softly, looking up at him. "What's wrong?" He blinked, feeling his mind unravel. She didn't look scared. She wasn't changed, but he was. And then came the whispers. At first, they were soft, barely audible fragments of words that slipped into the silence when the streetlights flickered. But as night fell, the whispers grew louder. From behind closed doors, from the creaking floorboards. His name, Ethan.
His stomach twisted.
The familiar shape of his home, the creaky floors, the quiet kitchen, they all felt wrong. A cold chill gripped his spine. He closed his eyes, trying to shut out the voices. But when he opened them again, the shadows seemed deeper, more alive, moving like something had been watching him all along. The city was still here. The streets, they were shifting again, growing darker, stretching like a living thing. And the whispers, they knew things only he could know. Lily turned, staring past him into the shadows. "The city isn't gone, Ethan. It's still here." His heart dropped.